Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we are going to be in conversation about trust and mistrust, especially when it comes to our institutions, and we'll specifically focus on government institutions. We'll also talk about activism. My guest for this conversation is Ethan Zuckerman. He's a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He teaches public policy, communication, and information. He is also starting a new research center that's called the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure, and he is the author of a book that we will be in conversation about. It is called Mistrust: How Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them. He joins us via Zoom. Ethan Zuckerman, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thanks so much, Mitch. It's wonderful to be with you, and I'm glad we got a chance to talk about these issues at a very mistrustful moment in American politics and American history.
Yeah, I'm glad to be having this conversation as well. I saw an article on your book, and I was thinking this is the kind of conversation I want to have. I was once a Capitol Hill correspondent many years ago, but something I've been thinking about is, and especially right now in this moment of COVID-19, and you lay out even before now, clearly, but especially in this moment, in our response to COVID-19, especially under the Trump administration, just how that trust in institutions, in government, is eroding even more so. So before we get there, just lay out for me why is trust important? And I'll also say, and I think you make this point, mistrust is also important. It's not like mistrust is bad.
No, that's absolutely right. Mistrust is actually very powerful fuel. It's actually something that's essential to having a highly functioning democracy. You need people to have a healthy level of mistrust of institutions to keep them honest. The danger is that we are losing trust in institutions sort of across the spectrum. So the way that I try to explain this to people is that people sort of assume that I've written a book about the Trump administration. I've written something about the ways in which we don't trust the medical system, so people aren't getting the COVID vaccine, or that people don't trust the media or don't trust the political system and so marched on the Capitol. That's not actually where this book came from. I started writing it trying to look at things like the Occupy movement and trying to figure out, at a moment where we had a Democratic president in the White House. We had, in some ways, the best sort of institutional acceptance of progressive values that I'd really seen during my lifetime. But I and a lot of other people, I think, felt like real change was not going to happen. That at the end of the day, the systems that have led to very high levels of inequality, that have led to systemic racism, that have led to disenfranchisement of a lot of the population, I didn't see real change being made on those issues. And I wanted to try to understand what was going on a systemic level that made it seem like change was much less possible than at a moment like the 1950s and 1960s with the civil rights movement. And as I looked at some of the differences between the 60s and the present, one thing really stood out to me, and that was trust in institutions. If we roll back to 1964 and you asked Americans, do you trust the government to do the right thing all or most of the time? 77% of Americans said, yes, I trust the government. That number fell down to 26% by the end of the Carter presidency in 1980. It recovered a little bit. We had a rally around the flag moment after 9/11. But through the Obama and the Trump presidencies, trust in government has been under 20%. So we've gone from almost 4 in 5 to less than 1 in 5. At the same time, trust in all other sorts of institutions, the media, the church, banks, big business, police, all across the board, trust in institutions has cratered in America. And this has happened in a lot of other advanced democracies. And so this presents this really interesting problem. If you don't think the government can do anything, or you don't trust it to take action, most of the formal routes to civics are closed. Why does it matter that we elect good people to the Senate or to the House of Representatives if we assume that they're simply paralyzed, they're not going anywhere? weirdly enough, even protest gets hard, right? Protest in the 1960s has a theory of change where the 63 March on Washington is literally a march on Washington. It's going to pressure President Kennedy to make movement on civil rights. The Women's March in the wake of the Trump election, no one seriously believes that this is going to change Donald Trump's mind or is going to lead to legislative change. It's still important as a statement of anger and a statement of frustration. But those formal tools for change, either through elections or through protest, they tend to fall away when we don't trust these institutions. And so having some sort of reasonable confidence that these institutions can make changes in our lives, that seems very important. My goal is not to persuade you to restore your trust in government. I'm not saying Biden's here, now let's everyone get together and trust. That's the opposite of what I'm saying. What I'm actually saying is that being mistrustful of institutions that are broken, we can channel that into actually reforming those institutions, really radically changing them, or in some cases, getting rid of them and building something new that takes their place. And for me, that's where the interesting action is.
I do want to get into that with you, but let's lay out more the situation at hand when it comes to the trust and mistrust of institutions. You went over it a little bit just a moment ago about what has happened over the past few decades, and the lack of, with time, the lack of trust in especially government institutions, but as you said, banking institutions, media, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think are some of the drivers of those dynamics?
So I spent a lot of time working on the internet and implications of the internet for social policy. And there seems to be this thinking that American politics is screwed up because of the internet. And I was interested in sort of moving back a little bit further and sort of understanding much longer trends. I do think one thing that is affecting trust is a broad societal relationship to information. We have a much better educated population than we did in the 1960s. Many more people are finishing high school, going on to college. We have a press that's much more critical. It's not spending as much time endorsing the views of people in power. It's doing more work exposing things. We do now have the internet and the possibility of much more open media. But I think that's one of only a few factors. I think a factor that you can never neglect when you look at the United States is endemic racism. I think one factor that has to come into play when we look at decreased trust in government in particular is that as we've had government that's been more inclusive of people of color, we have seen white trust in government go down. I think this is a classic sort of racist reaction to my privileged group is no longer as privileged. I'm going to lose confidence there. But that doesn't necessarily explain trust in other institutions. Here are the two ones that I think are big. The first one is rising inequality. We have seen massive, massive rises in economic inequality in the US, also in Europe, where there's a crisis in trust, in Russia, where there's an enormous crisis in trust. When people feel like they are not doing as well fiscally as their parents, when people feel like their kids are not doing as well as we are doing, that tends to corrode faith in entire systems. And I think looking at the ways in which the current American neoliberal capitalist system is failing most people is something that we have to look at in terms of trust in institutions. And then finally, institutions fail. And when they fail, and when we know about the failure, mistrust is a very reasonable response. Trust in big business and in banks cratered after the 2007-2008 subprime lending crisis. And you know what? It should have. We should have realized at that point that our banking system was really not designed for the benefit of most people. Similarly, trust in the medical system and particularly the nexus between the medical system and the political system has cratered in many countries that, like ours, have done poorly with COVID-19. So if you genuinely fail, you can expect trust in an institution to fall. The flip side, and this is the good news, is that countries that have done well, countries that did well with COVID, are experiencing waves of trust. Taiwan, historically, is a pretty mistrustful society. You had literally a political revolution there in 2014. They're enjoying very high trust in government because the government's response to COVID-19 has not only been so competent, but it's been so participatory. Citizens have been deeply involved with the response. And being involved with systems is one of the best ways to get people to be confident about them.
You write quite a bit about Taiwan in your book. Tell me more about what has happened there.
Taiwan is fascinating. I think Taiwan is maybe the most underexplored and underappreciated country from a U.S. perspective right now. I think a lot of people in the US sort of assume essentially a Cold War between China and Taiwan. That's probably not the right way to think about it. Taiwan's got about 22 million people, and a million of those people are living in mainland China. So the two economies are deeply linked. They're deeply, deeply interconnected. Um, Taiwanese politics really has the main issue of what's the relationship with China? Do we want to get closer? Do we want to stay independent? There was a revolution in the country where students occupied parliament in 2014. That revolutionary government ended up taking power, and in taking power, radically rethought how government worked. Many of the people who were involved with that revolution, weirdly enough, were open source software people. And they have engaged in sort of opening up and open sourcing the government. They have a minister without portfolio, Audrey Tang, who is largely in charge of ensuring that government departments are actually in touch with citizens, learning from them and involving them in processes. And so, just one example of how this worked: Taiwan masked up early on in the threat of COVID. And like in the US, they didn't have central mass distribution. They told people to go to pharmacies and get masks, but pharmacies ran out of masks. Some clever Taiwanese citizen decided to build a crowdsourcing site where you could say, does your local pharmacy have masks? And you could put that information online. He builds this site. It's fantastically popular. He actually runs up like a $10,000 Amazon Web Services bill the first weekend he has it up. Government calls him up and says, we love this project. Do you mind if we move it to the government servers and make it the official government site for helping figure out how we get masks? And they start working together and the government pays his bills. That's extraordinary. I mean, can you imagine that? We've seen in the United States, we can't even do federal level COVID data reporting. We've had folks associated with the Atlantic magazine trying to figure out how to come up with COVID statistics because the government couldn't do it. Literally within 48 hours, the government recognizes the citizen initiative and says, let's find a way to build this and help this grow. It's a really extraordinary approach to government that I think there's just an enormous amount to be learned from.
You mentioned the student-led revolution in 2014. Did it take a revolution for something like that to happen?
I think one of the things that's very interesting, so one of the things I talk a lot about in the book is what it actually takes to topple a broken institution. And let's talk just for a moment here about maybe the most broken institution in the United States right now, which is policing. We have seen with the Black Lives Matter protests, we have seen with defund the police, a recognition that policing is just not working for communities of color. And when we look at the epidemic of violence against Black and Brown people by police in the United States, and the ways in which incremental steps towards change have been fought every step of the way, the power of police unions, the unwillingness of police departments to sanction police officers who are involved consistently with violent incidents, this is an institution that demands a radical rethink. The trick is you can't just look at this institution and say, okay, that's broken, it's got to go. There are numerous people whose livelihoods depend on that continued institution. And so unless there's power that comes in at the same time as new thinking about how to reform it, it's very, very difficult to unseat institutions. Revolutions are one way they happen. So having a government fall and a new government come in is a moment where it's possible to rethink an institution. I'm really much more interested in, are there moments where we can look at an institution and look at it really thoughtfully and say, you know what, it's just time for a change. One of the places I'm maybe most inspired by there is the movement of progressive prosecutors. These are prosecutors in the United States, DAs, who are coming in and taking that office explicitly because they think that the DA's office should not be focused on putting as many people as possible in prison, but actually focused on community justice. And so looking at Philadelphia, which has one of these progressive DAs, and looking at this and essentially saying, we are going to stop prioritizing drug convictions, we're going to stop prioritizing prostitution convictions, and we're going to start expanding the toolkit of what the DA's office has. We don't always have to work on putting people in prison. We can work on restitution. We can work on community strategies for healing. We can work on diversion and helping people get the help they need around addiction rather than prosecution. That's a way of radically reimagining an institution. And for me, that's actually the most promising area to explore here.
And I guess that's something we can say that's happened here in this country in the past few years is a shift culturally, or a shift in the norms when it comes to such things as Black Lives Matter or Me Too, the Me Too movement.
That's right. So one of the things I talk about a lot in the book is, what are levers we have for change? I think many of us end up believing that the only way to make change is to pass laws, and that's just simply not true. Matt Iglesias reviewed my book in the New York Times, and I felt like he got a lot of it, but one of the things that he missed, he ended up saying, well, the Me Too movement has been a failure. There's been no real change from it. That's not true. There's been enormous change from Me Too. It's just that it's been changed more around norms than it has been around laws. And honestly, that's probably where it needs to change, right? There are laws on the books preventing sexual harassment and assault. They are not well enough enforced because workplaces often have unwritten policies that protect harassers and sort of make it okay. One of the things that's happening in the wake of Me Too is workplaces realizing that it's not okay to shuffle someone around the workplace because he's harassed one person and then moving them to another department. We actually have to confront harassment. There have to be consequences for it. And there we're starting to see the cultural change. I think that our current theories of change tend to undervalue that norms-based change. And I think this is another case where maybe we took the wrong lesson from the 60s. In the 60s, we start seeing shifts around civil rights that happen in law and then pull the society along with it. So Loving versus Virginia, which is the decision that makes interracial marriage legal. When you polled Americans at the moment of Loving versus Virginia and said, should Black and white Americans be able to get married? Fewer than 20% of people would have told you that they supported interracial marriage. Very, very unpopular. By the time that we get to Oberfelge, which makes gay and lesbian marriage possible, you're at a point where 65, 70% of Americans approve of homosexual marriage. You're now seeing norms leading laws rather than the other way around. Right now, our fairly conservative court system is sort of working to catch up with those norms changes. So if you as an activist go ahead and change norms, that's a way of pulling law with you rather than having law pushing, which in many cases was what it was doing in the 1950s and 60s.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Ethan Zuckerman. He's a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He teaches public policy, communication, and information, and he's the author of the book that we are in conversation about, which is called Mistrust: How Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them. I do want to go back and touch upon a few things that you have already said. One, you mentioned something earlier when we were talking about Taiwan, but this isn't exclusive to Taiwan. You find it here too, and that's open source software. I don't know if everyone knows exactly what that means and what the potential of open source software is, but I will say now that we are recording our conversations on video on this radio program, we're actually doing it through open source software. We're using this great broadcasting program called OBS. I think it's Open Broadcasting System or something like that. Tell me more about what we mean when we say open source software and its potential.
Sure. So when you think about most software most of us use, right? If, for instance, you use an Apple iPhone, you don't have the opportunity to open up those applications and see the computer code that makes them up. And that has all sorts of implications. You're not able to customize that software for your needs. The people who have made that software can control whether it can or can't be installed. They're able to monetize it in different sorts of ways. There's lots of cases where closed software may be useful. Sometimes it's actually very important for reasons of security. But in a lot of cases, it's to many people's benefits to make the software open and to allow people to hack it and to expand it and to sort of build it towards their own purposes. My lab at MIT and now my lab at UMass release all of our software open source. We do it mostly for reasons of academic collaboration. We want other academics to see what we're doing, to evaluate our work, to have the chance to sort of build on it. I would say that the spirit of open source communities, and that includes the software world, it also includes projects like Wikipedia, where people can go in and edit an article and sort of participate within it. These are projects that gain their legitimacy not so much by their social position. You know, here is Apple, it's one of the most wealthy companies in the world, therefore it is legitimate. They gain their legitimacy through involvement of a community. Wikipedia, without a community maintaining it, just doesn't do anything. It's not useful. Even the company, the group that you're talking about with OBS, has to have a community that is committed to it over long periods of time to make it useful. So I think having open source, but even more than that, having community spirited projects where people are working together to ensure that a large project succeeds, I think they're enormously important. You referenced my new center, which is the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure. The institution that I've sort of become convinced that I want to tilt at windmills with is the institution of social media. It's the Facebooks, the Twitters, all those sorts of platforms out there. I am very concerned not only about surveillance capitalism, these models where these companies make money by monetizing our attention and tracking our behavior. I'm also really concerned that participating in these communities where we have no role in their governance, we have no authority over how they restrict or enable speech, that this is actually really bad for us as citizens. It's atrophying our democratic muscles. And I think one thing that's enormously important is to cultivate communities where we take responsibility for building things and for governing those systems that we build. You know, I think you can argue that different flavors of public radio, particularly Pacifica, which tends to be run with quite a bit of user support and contribution and real community support behind things, these are the sorts of healthy communities that lead towards trusted rather than mistrusted institutions.
A lot of mistrust within Pacifica Radio. Trust me, my friend.
Well, and there's questions about whether that can be healthy as well.
Fair enough. Yeah. No, fair enough. The whole issue around social media, and you spent a lifetime so far, not that you're that old, but in your career so far on digital media, the whole thing about social media is really, I think, important and interesting and complex right now. We saw, for example, the power of Twitter and Facebook to be able to remove and suspend the account of an acting president. Now, there may very well be a good reason for it. If somebody's inciting violence, that can make a lot of sense. But it also must make us stop and think about the implications of what this means moving forward, and how these decisions are made, and who gets to decide, and these kinds of issues.
So let's wrestle with January 6th, and then let's move from January 6th into talking about the platforms, because I think we've got to wrestle with them together. One of the things that's most uncomfortable about having this book out there is that central to the book is the term insurrectionist. I borrowed two words from Chris Hayes, who's written about institutionalists and insurrectionists. Institutionalists believe the way forward is to work within existing institutions. Insurrectionists believe that those institutions might be broken. We might have to tear them down and start from scratch. But now we have, on January 6th, literal violent insurrection. So how do we understand that? I think the first thing to say is that these are not insurrectionists the way that I'm thinking about them. They're not trying to build a new institution. If anything, what they're doing is deeply conservative. It's reactionary. We want the person in power to remain in power, even if the system have tried to oust them. But it's also important to think about mistrust as something that can be weaponized. There is genuine, authentic mistrust throughout American populations for reasons of failed systems, inequality, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also weaponized mistrust, right? The Trump administration has channeled mistrust of media, mistrust of government, and has essentially said, I'm the only one who can lead you through that. And so that is something that has had enormous political power, has helped lead people to actually the riot at the Capitol. And understanding that mistrust can be harnessed and can be weaponized is really important to think about. Now, let's ask this question about how social media sort of comes into play on this. President Trump, I think there's a very good argument, is using social media as one of the main ways of speaking to his followers and to rev them up. The video statement he made on the 6th after the Capitol riots was just extraordinary. I mean, it was basically a warm hug to people who had just violated the U.S. Capitol. You know, it was stand by and stand back, but to the nth degree. And in the context that it came out, it felt very much like yelling fire in a crowded theater. I can understand in the short term why it makes sense for platforms to deplatform him at that point. We don't know what deplatforming a figure like Donald Trump does. We've seen figures like Alex Jones get deplatformed. It does reduce their influence, although the people who continue to follow Alex Jones, now that he's on something like Gab, go further and further out into the fringes. It's possible that if Donald Trump gets back online, whether it's on Parler or on Gab or on his own social network, that he may pull tens of millions of Americans with him, and we will have to look very closely at that conversation. It is possible to argue that Twitter and Facebook did the right thing in the short term, and also argue that in the long term, letting private companies have that much power over speech is a very bad idea. My take is not that we should then heavily regulate those companies and essentially transfer control of speech from private platforms to a government regulator. That also strikes me as a bad idea. I think this is a moment where we look at this and we say, that's a lot of concentration of power. What are other things that we can do around competitive policy to make it more likely that we have a diverse social media ecosystem and we don't have the centrality of control that we have right now?
Many years ago, I was in conversation with Tim Wu, who wrote the book The Master Switch. And he's written other books as well, and I think since then. But The Master Switch really affected me, and in the way that I see social media in the history of media in general. And he makes the argument in this book that every media, when it's new, whether it be the telephone, film, radio, is very open at the beginning and presents all these opportunities, but then it is enclosed. It's enclosed by the big companies, the big film companies, the telephone companies, the radio companies, on and on. I and basically he was saying this is we see the internet as this wide open free place now. Don't expect it always to remain that way. And I feel like that process of enclosing the internet has accelerated actually in these past 4 years, in part because maybe it's justified, right? It's an open question because of the response to Trump and his supporters.
So Tim wrote the Master Switch at a moment where I think in many ways we were trying to get over our cyber utopianism. Tim and I are part of sort of the same generation of internet scholars who really grew up on this idea that the internet was going to be open, it was going to be open to competition, no one would be able to monopolize it. And we're older and balder and more bearded now. And I think we all sort of understand that there was a lot of naivete there. Tim actually did a great job of predicting some of the dark aspects of the future. But let me tell you a slightly different history. So here's a history of radio, right? This medium that we both actually, as it turns out, care very deeply about. This medium becomes physically possible in 1912 with the invention of the triode vacuum tube amplifier. People have all of this radio gear that's been manufactured. It's used during World War I to send dots and dashes back and forward. It turns out you slot in this tube and suddenly you can actually communicate either sound or music. Within 10 years of the invention of the triode vacuum tube amplifier, so by 1922, you've got three totally separate parallel systems for how radio works in different parts of the world. Tim's narrative of the US is exactly right. Radio starts, some of it is non-commercial, some of it is commercial, but very different than we think of. There are radio stations in hotels that broadcast the orchestra in the ballroom. There are radio stations in department stores that talk about the sales and how to come and get a record player. There's universities, there's churches, but eventually, yes, it's big media businesses driven by advertising. But there's two other totally different models, right? The Soviet Union, radio rises at the same time as the USSR. And radio is the tool for persuading the mostly illiterate peasants that the Soviet vision of communism is the way to go. And so radio there is completely uncompetitive. It's mostly loudspeakers in factories and in public squares. When you finally get to an economy advanced that people can have their own radios, they only have one dial on them. All you need is volume because there's nothing else to tune into. And then in the UK, you end up with the BBC, which is a singular entity like in the Soviet Union, but really, really different. It's actually an independent voice of the public that manages at times to be very, very critical of the government. One of the things that happens really early on in the history of the BBC is a national labor strike. And the BBC has the prime minister on, but they also have labor leaders on the radio at the same time. And this is unprecedented. This idea that you could actually hear the voice of the opposition broadcast to the nation is really a stunning way of thinking about what this medium could do. So my point on this is Tim's vision in which sort of corporate hegemony closes off any new technology is not inevitable. A new technology comes on the scene, and through a combination of political and social forces, it can go any number of different ways. The other bit of good news in this is that you can actually come into systems after the fact and try to correct. The US rolls out television in a pure commercial model. And then in the 1960s, we start to figure out that we're doing a lousy job of building kids' television. We're doing a lousy job of building public service television. And we have a wave of public broadcasting that comes about in the late 1960s and early 1970s to try to correct. So there is no reason to accept a world in which Facebook, an institution that deservedly has lost a lot of our trust, is the inevitable way that social media works. we can change path and other ways of doing these things are possible. That's the imagination that I'm asking people to look at institutions that are not working and ask this question of, do we reform them? Do we try to take them back to their original values? Do we pressure them from the outside to get them to stand upright? Or do we just reimagine them entirely and build something better in their stead?
Where do you come down on those questions?
Well, we're talking about social media, I think, in part because that's where I've ended up on this, right? I spent 7 years writing this book. In some ways, I was trying to figure out why I wasn't psyched about Occupy, and why I was having trouble believing that the movement, which I think did many things very, very well, was going to have a hard time making systemic change. And so I was interested in this question of, could you both be frustrated with Obama and disappointed by Occupy, and find some way to channel change? In the course of researching and writing the books, there were moments where I felt deeply institutionalist. I think a lot of people on the left felt like institutions were the only thing that could save us from the excesses of a Trump presidency. Where I came out in the end of it was this realization that we have to have the creativity to look at an institution and just say, this one's just not working for us anymore. And we need to find a way around them. What I hope for the Mistrust book is that it helps give people something of a toolkit to think about how they can re-envision and potentially change institutions. Social media is an institution where I feel a real personal sense of responsibility. I was involved with building a company in the early 1990s that was one of the first companies to have what we now call user generated content, i.e., users get to create material and put it online. Some of these models around ad supported social media are models that I helped to build.
I heard you are the creator of the pop-up ad.
Tragically, that's true. I was working for a company called tripod.com. We were hosting homepages for about 20 million web users. We needed to find some way to pay for a very expensive service. Advertisers didn't like having ads on the user pages because they didn't control the content on them. So I created the pop-up ad as a way of being able to open an ad and open a window the user had control over. I did not create the pop-ups that follow you over the web or can't be closed or that tell you to click, and some Nigerian prince will ask you for your personal information. But yeah, absolutely, and I bear responsibility for the slippery slope, or some of the slippery slope, of online advertising that has gotten so intrusive and so invasive. In many ways, what I think and my colleagues got wrong was it would have been a really good moment to move towards a service-oriented internet rather than a purely free internet. Because, of course, what we've now all figured out is that a free internet means that we are the ones for sale. Um, so this is one of the many things that I'm trying to find a way to redress. I came out of writing Mistrust saying I should find an institution that I think is not functioning well and see what I can do to reform it. And what I'm now finding is that there's actually a lot of opportunity to reimagine these institutions of social media and potentially come up with something that works much better.
Well, what does that mean, service-oriented internet? What would that look
So,
like?
Pacifica, as well as other forms of public radio, provides an essential public service. And the people who support Pacifica recognize that they're getting a service and chip in to make it possible. Um, those sorts of hybrid revenue models, where you might have a service that is in part supported by taxpayer funding, you might have a service that's supported by voluntary contribution. If you do end up using advertising, you're doing it in a way where you have something like a data cooperative, where people are deciding what data to share and what not to share. Those are more responsible models than what we have right now. Services are really important. It's deeply helpful to have something that we are paying for, because then we care about it. We take responsibility for it. We demand responsibility for it in a way that we don't always demand responsibility for something that is given to us for free. Free is potentially very dangerous, and free in a system where we don't have any control over the governance, we don't have any control over how those platforms are run. Free there is incredibly dangerous.
It is interesting to think about what we're getting for free on the internet is from the corporate interests on the internet.
And corporate interests who are very explicit about what they want from us. What they want from us is our attention. They want to harness our attention, they want to repackage it, and they want to give it to the people who are bidding for it. And you can decide whether or not this is a legitimate business model. There's a worthwhile debate to be had about whether that is something that we should be engaging in or not. But independent of that debate, you can also make a decision that it is not a healthy business model to fund certain kinds of conversations. I am a type 1 insulin dependent diabetic. It would be helpful for me to have spaces in which I can have conversations about managing my diabetes. But I really don't want to do that in a space where someone is monitoring the conversation and deciding how to target advertising to me around a very personal health issue. And that feels like something where we can either try to regulate our way around it and essentially say, nope, that's too sensitive. You can't advertise around those components. Or you can look at it and say, maybe that's not a conversation that takes place in purely free spaces. Maybe we look for spaces that are important enough to have that we finance them with public monies in one fashion or another, and we have genuine public goods.
It seems to me when it comes to social media, there is an inherent aspect to it towards centralization. And what I mean by that is, and I recognize there are people, I have anarchist friends. They're nowhere near Facebook. If I want to communicate with them, I got to get on Signal, right? Another open source software, communication software. But for most, I think for many people, if not most people, you want to be on a platform where you can reach as many people as possible, which inherently, that's why I say I think it's almost inherent that it would become so centralized. Like I would like to think of having maybe other social media platforms. I'm sure there are other social media platforms, but most people aren't going to them because everyone else is not there.
So it's actually worth thinking of Facebook as two separate services. Um, it has a communication service where people can have conversations and post photos. Frankly, it's not great. It's actually not as full featured as a lot of other tools out there. The other thing that Facebook has is a directory, and its directory is amazing. There is a very, very good chance that unless the person that you know is an anarchist, they're on Facebook, because it's so pervasive and so many people are on it. I think people remain on Facebook because of the directory, not so much because of the service. I am on Facebook to the extent that I am because I have people that I love and care about from high school. And this is the way that I remain in touch with them. I have friends from elementary school who I see on Facebook.
That's exactly why I'm on Facebook. Yeah.
I think the key to this is to say, can we have a lot of different networks that interoperate? So, for instance, if my friends who are on Facebook and want to remain on Facebook can still stay in touch with me, if the primary posting that I'm doing is on something like Mastodon, that would be a great place to be. And I might be members of communities that have different rules associated with them. I might be part of a community where the rule is very high privacy and we're not letting advertisers in and you can't share material from this community. There's other communities where, of course, you can share and you want things to go viral around the web. Basically, the barrier here is imaginative as much as it is technical. We actually know how to build distributed social networks. We know how to build distributed directories. What we have a hard time imagining is an alternative to Facebook that isn't like PBS Facebook. The alternative I'm actually talking about here is a whole set of small communities which you might interact with for very different reasons. And the people that I'm interacting with to talk about type 1 diabetes might be a very different group of people than the ones that I'm talking local politics with. But having those sort of interlocking communities, preferably ones that are self-governing, that's the idea of digital public infrastructure. And for me, that's where the mistrust work led me. Looking at this and saying the obligation is not just to say, I don't like this institution, I'm going to boycott it, which in many cases is what people are advocating with Facebook, but to look at this and say, this is a useful institution. It's actually very helpful socially to have those forms of lightweight connectivity with old friends. But I really hate the way this one works. Can I imagine and build a different institution in its place? That's the challenge that I'm trying to give people with this book.
And finally, for that shift to happen, can that happen from below? Can it happen organically, or do you need laws and regulation around that to make it
What
happen?
I end up sort of arguing is that social change at its most effective uses multiple levers at the same time. I talk about four levers of change in the book. I talk about law, which I think we mostly understand. I talk about markets, this idea that getting a whole lot of people to act as consumers is actually a very powerful force for some changes. Technology can be a very powerful lever. You invoked Signal before. Signal is one of the core examples in the book. How do you go from a highly surveillance environment to an environment that's very hard to surveil? Signal really changed that equation for a lot of people very quickly. And then norms, this idea that you change hearts and minds as well as changing laws. I end up arguing that if you can put the four of those together, if you can make change working on those four levers simultaneously, that's often much more powerful than changing one thing at a time. And so around social media, absolutely, there's legal change that would be useful to see forcing interoperability with some of these big monopoly platforms. There's technical changes, there's market changes. In some ways, around social media, the hardest one is a norms change. It's getting people to imagine, rather than having one network to rule them all, having community that works much more like community works in the real world, which is we're all members of dozens of different communities with their own rules and norms and purposes. And I would argue that's actually a much healthier way of interacting with social media than having a single monolith.
Ethan Zuckerman has been our guest. He's a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He teaches public policy, communication, and information. He's also starting a new research center that's called the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure. And he has joined us for a conversation about his book, which is called Mistrust: How Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them. Ethan Zuckerman, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you for taking this time.
Thanks so much, Mitch. It's really been a pleasure. It's been great to be with you.